Good morning, and welcome to another Seize the Day. Trust you guys are waking up, having a really good morning, feeling refreshed, ready to begin a new day. Boy, these days have been unseasonably warm, haven't they? I mean, even for me, I'm over here, and I can't believe the temperatures. But it made for a great weekend, and we all know winter's coming, so we'll take it while we can. Trust you guys had a really good weekend. We had an opportunity to spend the weekend with some of the congregants from Bethany. Just had a great time together and some good fellowship. So really good weekend. Looking forward to this week. Just as a general, challenge to everyone, just make sure tomorrow you vote. It is a privilege that we have as citizens of this country, and we need to exercise that. I am certain in the core of who I am that we serve a God who is in control of all things. All the nations are in His hands. He says He turns the hearts of kings. So, but it doesn't remove the responsibility that we have as citizens of a country to do right, to do justly, to love mercy, right, and to walk humbly with our God. That is one of the challenges that God places before His people, right? To do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with our God, and that's always a part. Even when the Israelites were told that they were going to be in exile for over 70 years. Didn't the Lord tell them to pray for the city in which they were going, that it might prosper? Because if the city prospered, they prospered. So I think God is giving us some really clear indications here that there are responsibilities that we have where we live, and we ought to exercise those rights. So, guys, make sure you vote tomorrow. This week, we are in another passage, Matthew 16, verses 5 through 12. It's a great passage that just picks up on the arguments of where Jesus had been engaged in with the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, and I think that for Jesus, that was always a good way for him to demonstrate more and more of his calling and who he was. So today's passage picks up on where this argument left off. And before we go there, I'd like to just bring to your attention what I had mentioned on this past weekend. And that is, you remember as a kid going on these family vacations, and if you had many siblings, brothers, sisters, everybody would be waiting around, and you're in the car, and everybody's cramped, and you're wondering, when are we going to get there? How much longer? I'm tired. I'm hungry. I got to go to the bathroom, and it just made those road trips, boy, just seem so long. And I wonder sometimes in our own walk with Jesus if it might even feel the same way. Like we lose sight of where we're going, right? We wonder, how long is it going to take us to get there? When are we going to get there? I'm tired. We lose sight of the end goal. And I think that's critical, especially at this juncture in our study together through the book of Matthew. Because our goal here, right, is to every week to come together to look through these passages in Matthew and then drill a little bit deeper so that we kind of understand what it is that Matthew is trying to communicate with us. We saw in the very beginning, the opening passages in the book was all about giving us some insight into Jesus's origins. His genealogy was the first thing that is being mentioned by Matthew, because he wants to firmly place Jesus as the son of David and the son of Abraham, because those were covenantal promises that God made with his people, that he would bring a deliverer, that there would be this Messiah that would come. And Matthew wants us to recognize that Jesus is that Messiah. And so in the beginning of his book, there is all of this understanding, right, of him coming, where he would be born, something about how he would be born, right, born of a virgin, and that she would give him a name, and his name would be, Emmanuel, God with us. See, all those passages are just to give us a reminder that Jesus is the Messiah that had been promised. And then we have Jesus in his teaching. And in his teaching, we are told that he spoke with authority that just left all those who heard him in awe. And if that was not enough, then we read all these passages about all the miracles that Jesus did. And then we started to see how the result of this ministry began to be many people who were following him. But then there were still those mainstreamed in the middle who were just curious. They wanted something from Jesus. They didn't want Jesus, right? They weren't going to follow him. They weren't going to take his teachings and put them deeper into their framework about who they are. They wanted just a healing. They were curious about some of his teachings, but it just remained at that level. Really, no commitment. And then there were those who were becoming more and more contentious, out and out rebellious against Jesus, finding ways to come together to plot how they might undermine his ministry. And for many, they were beginning to plot on how they might kill Jesus. They saw him as a real threat to their authority, to their positions, and the result of that was Jesus needed to be removed. And again, all these things, don't they speak of the heart of man? These are the same kind of emotive, aberrations that we're still dealing with in the days in which we're living. Anger, hate, jealousy, slander, malice, right? It's all the works of this flesh. And it's popping its head in the same generation of Jesus. So then now we look and we begin to realize, okay, we don't want to miss this opportunity. We want to understand what Jesus is teaching us. And so Jesus then begins here in Matthew chapter 16 with another test by the Pharisees and teachers of the law. But Jesus' desire is for them to understand. And as I started off with my opening, just little, illustration here about, are we there yet? Jesus wants them to get there. He wants them to understand. And think about it. Matthew chapter 10 was already about the great commissioning of these disciples, calling them and telling them that they're going to be sent with the authority and with the same message that Jesus was preaching. He told them where to go. He told them what to say. This was all about Jesus replicating himself through his disciples. And then we just finished learning, right? Just to tie this all together, we learned that Jesus says that the only sign that they would receive is the sign of Jonah. And what did Jonah do? Jonah, after being regurgitated from that whale, goes out and preaches. And it says all of Nineveh, the capital of Assyria, they wind up repenting. And then Jesus says, using that as an example, he says, the Son of Man is also going to be in the belly of the earth for 3 days and 3 nights. But what's going to come as a result of Jesus being resurrected? The proclamation of the kingdom of heaven is not going to be done by Jesus. It's going to be done by his followers. See, the sign of Jonah, Jesus says someone greater than Jonah is here. Why? Because Jonah went out and preached to this one nation. God is going to raise, men and women from every nation, And they're going to go out as salt of the earth, light of the world. They're going to go out and proclaim this good news of the kingdom of heaven. Yesterday I was in church, and I was speaking about this passage and reminding everyone again of this call of God on our life to be these kinds of witnesses. And this woman came to me, and she's a native from Kenya, and she showed me a picture of her nephew. And her nephew is in the armed services, very handsome, very fit. And he is also the chaplain for his fellow soldiers. She showed me a video of them having a service together. All these young men, women, just joyful in the Lord, man, just celebrating, and he's having a huge impact in this town of Mombasa, which is on the eastern side of Kenya. And I just sat there for a moment. And I think, here is this man working so diligently for the cause of Christ in another entire part of the world with people that we'll never even meet, in a culture different than ours, and yet same Lord, same Spirit, right? Same faith. And that's what Jesus was promising. This sign of Jonah is that this word is going to spread, and people will be responding to that. So it is vitally important then that the disciples get the message, that they understand this. And that's why I want you to listen with that in mind as I just read through this passage for you as we begin our week with Matthew 16, beginning at verse 5. Having just been tested by the Pharisees and the Sadducees, it says, then they went across the lake. But notice here it says the disciples forgot to take bread. I'm always amazed at sometimes these little details that you find in the scriptures. And very often, it's those little details that begin to give us greater insight into what's being said here. So Jesus just being tempted or being tested by these Pharisees and Sadducees, he gives them this example of Jonah, which is really saying to you and me, as I just said, that the disciples, the people who are going to be following Jesus, they're going to see that they're going to be spread all over the world. They are going to be that light that shines in the midst of the darkness, the salt of the earth. And so they get into the boat. Disciples forget to bring food, right, to bring bread. And then Jesus says to them, be careful, be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Now, how many times have the disciples been with Jesus when he's already begun to teach them, and they have to, when he's done, kind of tug at his robe and say, Lord, can we have a little alone time with you? Because we're not catching this. It's going over our head. I mean, all of Matthew 13, right? The kingdom parables, where Jesus was teaching the kingdom, he said, this is what the kingdom of heaven is like. And then he would give them the parable, and then the disciples would be on the side, and Jesus says, blessed are your ears, for you get to hear and understand. And he says, because the one who hears this word and understands it is going to produce a great crop in his life. He's going to be changed. And then, not only is he changed, but listen to this, then we become change agents. How cool is that? Our lives change, and then we become change agents. So this idea of them understanding was always critical. And yet Jesus often spoke in ways that you could just, like the text goes on, and you're going to see that they're looking at each other. Because look what it says in verse 7. It says, they discussed this among themselves and said, it's because we didn't bring any bread. Really? That this is what they come up with. They forgot bread, and then Jesus is talking about yeast. So they're saying, well, I guess it's because we didn't bring any bread. The danger is that sometimes we read these stories and we already know the conclusions. But Matthew is writing, unfolding for us the events that are taking place early in Jesus' ministry. I've tried to avoid going to the end of the book and removing some of the tension by showing you how everything is resolved, because I want us to understand this is something that is progressive. It's just like you and me. Our faith, where we are today, hopefully, if the Lord gives us, time in this world, we're going to be further along in our faith in a year, or more, right? What we find is that we are growing, that we are progressing. You see that just in the landscapes, right? When we first moved, we had a couple of these yew tree, bushes in front of the house, and they grew so tall, they got out of control. We had to take them down just a week or so ago, and yet incrementally they have been growing all along. And then all of a sudden one day you turn around and go, "Oh my gosh, that is really big." Well, it's the same thing with our faith. Like God, we're growing and growing, and then all of a sudden you turn around. You use another analogy. Remember when your kids were small, summer would be over. You take out the school clothes, and all of a sudden the pants are above their ankles, and their shirt sleeves don't fit them anymore. And you're thinking, "Oh my gosh, these kids are growing so quickly." Yeah. This we want to see, and Matthew is giving us some insight into how this is happening in the lives of the disciples. But he also shows Jesus' reactions. So notice, after Jesus says, "Be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees," the disciples start thinking about themselves, and they said, "It's because we didn't bring any bread." That's the conclusion that they've drawn from what Jesus had to say. Now, we can't be too critical of them. We can't say, "Well, how could they be so obtuse? Wouldn't they get it?" But no, I think sometimes think about sometimes when you're reading the scriptures and you're kind of a little dumbfounded. And then afterwards, when you get to a place where you really understand, then you go, "Oh, how did I miss that?" Because that's right there on the page. Well, look at verse 8. Jesus is aware of their discussion, isn't he? And so he knows that what they're talking about, and they've drawn the wrong conclusion. There's an analogy between the yeast that is used to make bread, but that's a different yeast that Jesus is intimating here in this passage. But they hear yeast, they think bread, and they've drawn the wrong conclusion. There is a correlation between yeast and bread, but just because there's a correlation doesn't mean that that's a confirmation. We see that all along, don't we? There's some things that correlate, but they're not there to confirm. And here, just so that we don't have to guess, Jesus says it. In verse 8, aware of their discussion, he says, "You have little faith. Why are you talking among yourselves about having no bread?" And then what does he say? He says, "Do you still not understand?" See, that's the key in this passage right now. What is it that they need to understand? What should they have understood? They're over here talking about, Jesus is talking about the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees. And they're thinking he's talking about bread. And Jesus then says, "You of little faith, why are you still talking among yourselves about having no bread? Do you still not understand?" There's a note of exasperation in Jesus' voice, isn't there? You can hear, him chiding them because they're not with the program yet. Come on, guys, you should be further along right now. There is this challenge. I love that, because you do realize that it's the same for us. God wants us to be growing. We are to be challenged. He's asking us, right, to grow deeper roots so that we would be more effective in the way in which we are out there representing him. I love a passage that's found in 2 Peter where they're told, it says, "If you add to your faith," and then there are all these virtues of brotherly kindness and patience and faithfulness, right? If you add to your faith all these virtues, Peter goes on to say, it will render your faith neither ineffective nor unproductive. So our faith is never meant to be ineffective and unproductive. There is to be an efficiency about our faith and a productivity to our faith. But that's only going to happen if we understand it, right? And if it becomes a part of us. So here Jesus is chiding them because they didn't get it yet. And then notice what he uses as examples. He says, don't you remember the 5 loaves for the 5,000 and how many basketfuls you gathered? Or the 7 loaves for the 4,000 and how many basketfuls you gathered? It wasn't too long ago that we looked at those passages, right? I hope you remember that the feeding of the 5,000 and the baskets that the feeding of the 5,000 was to a Jewish audience. The baskets that they gathered numbered how many? 12. And why 12? Because it was representative of the 12 tribes of Israel. When was the last time the 12 tribes of Israel were given bread? Yeah, it was Moses who gave them the manna that the Father had given him. The Israelites fed in this wilderness by God giving them bread from heaven. And now Jesus is that bread from heaven. And he says to the disciples in John's gospel, he says, you follow me because I gave you bread, but I'm the bread of heaven. You need to be eating of me. And people walked away because that was too difficult. And so here, the 4,000, there were 7 loaves. And that's being given us now in distinction to the feeding of the 5,000, because the 7 loaves for the 4,000, right? That was a whole Gentile group. And how many baskets were gathered there? 7 basketfuls, right? A number that we looked at as being complete and mature. It's like when God, the 7 days of creation, right? On the 7th day, God looked at all that he had done and rested and said to himself, this is good. Yeah, this is a time of maturing. It's like at the end of in the book of Revelation, when you have the 7 signs, the 7 seals, the 7 trumpets, right? All of this culminating this redemptive history. So God is saying in these miracles, not only, well, here's the question. What is God saying through all those miracles? So you're one of those disciples, and we've just seen the story. You've just witnessed Jesus feeding all of the Jews in this feeding of the 5,000. And then you see him do the same exact thing again, only now it's an entirely Gentile audience. What are the conclusions that you're drawing? You're a disciple of Jesus. You're seeing him up close and personal. And so Jesus now is using those moments and saying, hey, do you guys still not understand? Don't you remember? What was it that they were to remember? And notice, it wasn't just about the bread. Because in verse 11, he says, how is it that you don't understand that I was not talking to you about bread? So they hear Jesus talking about the yeast of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. They draw the conclusion that he's talking about bread because there's this correlation between yeast and bread. Jesus says, no, you should have understood already what I was doing in the feeding of the 5,000 and the feeding of the 4,000, so that you recognize that this is not about bread. And now you're probably thoroughly confused, as I'm sure the disciples were. They're sitting there thinking, I'm not sure I'm following. Well, let's break it down a little bit. On the one hand, Jesus is demonstrating that he has power over this creation, doesn't he? He could create something like from 5 loaves and 2 fish, or the 7 loaves that he fed the 5,000. So there is this power that he demonstrates, but Jesus has been demonstrating that power all along. Think about all the healings that he has done, the walking on the water, the stilling of the wind. so many ways in which Jesus has already demonstrated authority and power. But you also realize that Jesus is using these miracles to underscore again that he is the Messiah that was promised. He is the one that Abraham was told from his descendants would come one that would bless all the nations of the world. And has Jesus not begun to do that? Do you forget the story of the Canaanite woman when Jesus says, look, I came to the lost sheep of Israel. I can't give the bread that should go to the children to the dogs. And she says, yes, Lord, but even the dogs eat from the crumbs of the table. And she showed such a humility. And Jesus commended her faith. And the disciples were there. They saw that. And then they moved from there and they fed the 4,000. So they're seeing that Jesus is this one who has come to bless all nations. He is this promised Messiah. And so they need to be drawing near and listening to him. They need to be following his lead, right? And here they are talking about bread. And then Jesus puts it simply. He says, how is it that you don't understand I was not talking to you about bread, but to be on guard against the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees? And then they understood that he was not telling them to guard against the yeast used in bread, but against the teaching of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Wow, that is an entirely different story, isn't it? Because that story right there, that when we start to think about what all of that entails, see, this is when you begin to realize, okay, in our days, Jesus is warning them to steer very far away from the influence that is being that the Pharisees and the Sadducees, have. They already shown their true colors, right? They have refused to repent and humble themselves before Jesus. In fact, every time he had taught them, they were silenced, right? They were used to the ones being in the authority, people gathering around listening to them. Now Jesus has taken that front center stage and has begun to open up the scriptures in a way that they had no authority to match that. Remember early on in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus would say, you have heard that it was said. And he would refer to the Ten Commandments. He says, but I say to you, putting his word on the same level as God's word, as God was the one who was the author of those Ten Commandments. Pharisees, Sadducees, they would never do that. They would think of that as blasphemy, making yourself equal to God. And that's exactly what Jesus was doing. But he was backing it up. He was demonstrating, that all of this prophetic word was being fulfilled in his ministry. And he had the actions to demonstrate it. But instead they impugn his motives. They say it's by the prince of demons that he drives out demons. They turned their walk into God, something that was external rather than internal. God was always about the heart, right? If the heart is receptive, then your life is going to bring forth fruit. He says, because it's not what goes into a man that defiles him. Remember, Jesus told us already, he says, it's what comes out of the mouth, because what comes out of the mouth comes out of the heart. And what comes out of the heart is what defiles the man. That's why Jesus is always about the renovation of the heart. It's not just about an external compliance. It's not about just external rules. It's about the internal motivations. Jesus wants to get a hold of our hearts so we can think his thoughts after him. But the Pharisees and Sadducees, they just turned their walk with God, and they tried to do that for everyone else into something that was never meant to be. They demonstrated a failure to love their neighbor, and instead they shunned them. They resisted, rebelled, and plotted to kill Jesus. And what they really believed, it found expression in their actions. And that's what grieved the heart of God. That's what grieved Jesus, because it was having such a detrimental impact on their lives. Because as a man thinketh in his heart, so is he. Right? Jesus is saying, think about all the actions are taking place because they stem from a heart that isn't right. And every once in a while, you see it in yourself too, don't you? You can almost surprise yourself by a reaction that you think, oh my gosh, like, why am I doing that? I know better. Because we're on this path of being conformed more and more into the image of Jesus. We're not there yet. But hopefully you see those signs of you growing more and more into maturity. And it's just like with children. You can see that all of a sudden they're getting a hold of it. They're recognizing, some of the things that you've been teaching them. And it's really, confirming, isn't it? So for Jesus, he's looking out at the Pharisees and Sadducees and say, they are leading the people in the wrong direction. And if the disciples aren't fully aware of what's going on, then what's going to happen is they're going to lead a whole bunch of people astray. They're going to be part of the problem instead of being part of the solution. So when Jesus says, be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees and the Sadducees, he's talking about their teaching, because that teaching is going to have a detrimental effect. And he doesn't want the disciples to be eating that, because it's going to taint everything that they do. And that's why they have to hold this line. They got to understand what Jesus is about. And that's why Jesus is a little annoyed with them right now, saying, come on, guys, you need to understand this. Why? Because as we opened up, they're the ones that are going to be led out as this witness. So thank you for being a part of this morning. We went a little bit long, and I'll try to be more mindful of the time. But what we think and what we begin to believe is very important. And we're going to spend this whole week talking about the teaching of the Pharisees and the Sadducees, right? What we're going to talk about was what is the problem with this yeast? And there are numerous places in the scriptures that'll get us right to the point. And we're probably going to take a look at the book of 2 Peter. So if you have some time, you might want to read that and become acquainted with it. Some really good insight into this passage. All right, my friends, you go have a great day. Seize the day, never forgetting that God is good all the time. And Lord willing, we'll spend more time again tomorrow. God bless you.